there, welcome back to the channel. I am Jay and I'm a historian, and over the next few weeks I'm going over some concepts that fascinate me and I think that most of you should know about, that as academic historians to take into consideration when we're doing our research. So, since the AHA meeting in 2024, I've been thinking a lot about the concept of periodization. For those who may not have heard of this concept, the simplest definition is that periodization is a tool that historians use to group related events that occur in certain periods to make it easier to study or present to the public and other academics. For example, when historians study British history during the reign of Queen Victoria, the period in which they are working is the Victorian Age. Whereas in the United States, the same time period between 1837 and 1901 has been divided into the Antebellum, Civil War, Reconstruction, and Gilded Ages. Further on the global stage, it is part of what historians call the long 19th century, 1789 to 1914. As you can see, periodization in general tends to be more regionally or nationally focused, but can also be global, and these periods can and do overlap other periods. What got me thinking specifically about the periodization of the Second World War was that one of the panelists at that session on the Second World War stated that the traditional starting date for the conflict of 1939 ignores the fact that there were other nations and theaters of battle that had already begun fighting since 1931. Well, the starting date of 1939 is based on when Germany invaded Poland. China had been at civil war with Japan since 1931, when the latter annexed Manchuria. And Italy began its African campaign by attacking Ethiopia in 1935. Further complicating the starting date of the Second World War is that each of these belligerents came into different theaters of the war at varying times. For example, Russia invaded Poland in September of 1939, but was in a non-aggression pact with Hitler in Germany until June of 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. As Russia had a non-aggression treaty with Japan during this time, it was able to focus its might on the Western territory until the collapse of Nazi Germany. And only after a 3-month pause to redeploy forces to the Far East did the Soviet Union enter into the war against Japan on August 7, 1945. Next is the issue of dating the end of World War II. Well, for convenience sake, it's been taught that the signing of the formal surrender treaty by Japan on September 2nd, 1945 was the end of the war. It causes the immediate aftermath of the Second World War to be overlooked. Between 1945 and 1955, Austria, Germany, and Japan were under Allied occupation as those countries were being reconstructed. Furthermore, there were the war trials in Nuremberg for the European War and Tokyo for the Pacific War that took place in 1946 and 1947 that should be studied. Finally, and a concept that I've been thinking about for more than a decade, should the Second World War even be viewed as a single war? Well, based on my own research of this conflict, I have concluded that World War II is an easy way to group several unique continental, regional, and oceanic wars involving many overlapping belligerents together to study and to present to the public. My argument is based on the premise that the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan, while having a treaty of support amongst themselves, did not conduct their campaigns with any coordination between the fronts. Essentially, while Germany and Italy did coordinate a lot of their campaigns, especially in Africa, Japan acted independently of the other Axis powers. Rather than viewing the Second World War as a single war, I now view it as 3 major wars that occurred simultaneously. with differing combat experiences for the men involved and employing different sets of tactics and strategies for the regions in which they were fought. Thus, World War II should be divided into the following three major regional wars. The Pacific War, which includes ground combat in Asia, namely China, Burma, and French Indochina, between 1931 and 1945. The African War, between 1935 and 1943. And finally, the European War, which includes the Battle of the Atlantic and excludes Germany's campaigns in Africa between 1939 and 1945. Therefore, I have concluded that World War II is a global period of conflict that occurred during the 1930s and 1940s. For that purpose, I've chosen to start this era in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and in this era with the end of the Allied occupation of Japan in 1952. While Austria continued to be occupied until 1955, this occupation did not have the impact on global political trajectory that the occupations of Germany and Japan had. Thus, it was excluded. Also, I do understand that my dating of this era does overlap the Great Depression during the 1930s and the start of the Cold War and the Korean War after 1945. But as I stated earlier, periodization of different eras can and do overlap all the time. Based on my current research into naval developments between 1889 and 1914, I've also rethought how I periodized the First World War. Until the last couple of years, I stuck with the generally accepted June 28, 1914 through November 11, 1918 as the dates for this period. However, my research has led me to conclude that there is at least a decade of events in the lead up to Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination, the appointment of Alfred von Tirpitz to head Germany's naval construction program in 1898, the Second World War causing a budget crunch in Great Britain, leading to Jackie Fisher being elevated to First Sea Lord, the Russo-Japanese War, the signing of the Triple Entente in 1907, the Agadir crisis in 1911, and of course Churchill being Churchill are all crucial factors that need to be taken into consideration in periodizing the First World War. Additionally, one needs to consider the aftermath of the conflict, as the Treaty of Versailles and the Washington Naval Conference were directly influenced by the war and its causes. Therefore, I consider the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 as the beginning of the First World War era, and was closed with the signing of the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. The Russo-Japanese War is a good starting point for this era, as that conflict resulted in a weakened Russia, particularly its navy, and convinced the Royal Navy that it could safely reduce its presence in the Western Pacific as Japan could handle itself. Ending this era with the Washington Naval Conference is logical too, as the victors of the First World War found themselves in the early stages of a new shipbuilding race, and the leaders of the Allied nations did not want to have a repeat of the Anglo-German naval arms race. One current periodization I do consider to be flatly wrong in its starting date, as you may have glanced in the slide previously, is that of the Atlantic revolutions, beginning with the American Revolution and ending with the revolutions of 1848. Well, the European revolutions in 1848 are natural into this era and had influenced numerous artists and writers, particularly Victor Hugo and Karl Marx. The current consensus of beginning this era in 1765 ignores the influence that the 7 Years' War had in the lead up to the American Revolution. It was in North America, especially in the region now known as Pittsburgh, where the 7 Years' War began. And due to this conflict nearly bankrupting Great Britain, Parliament opted to tax the colonists on the East Coast in order to offset some of the debt. Thus, 1754 is a better starting point for the Atlantic Revolutionary era. I I could go on and on about periodization, but at this point you have a pretty good understanding of this concept. Also, I will let you know, no two historians are going to agree on any exact dates for periodizing an era, as we are just as diverse as the rest of our population. So I hope you learned something a bit about periodization, and I hope that helps you understand why, when you say go read a basic overview of the First World War, why we're going all the way back into the 19th century to explain concepts. And that's because the past is not clear-cut. There are a lot of factors that go into how an event happens, and having this concept of periodization helps us narrow down where all the major factors were. So that said, I hope you like this little summary of periodization. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the channel, and also share this with anyone you think is interested. I'll be back next week with a historical concept, and as always, please feel free to leave any comments. Make sure you cite your sources, and please be nice to each other in that area. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.